Miracles are scientifically impossible, right? That's at least what one of history's most influential philosophers tried to convince everybody of. And that's what we're going to think about on today's edition of Authentic. Quite some time ago, a regular listener asked me to talk about the Scottish philosopher David Hume, a man who became something of a poster boy for 18th century atheism. Even though it's not entirely clear that David Hume completely abandoned his belief in a personal God. The way he wrote actually suggests that he might have remained something of a theist to the very end of his life, which means he did believe in the existence of a God who's personally involved in human history. But, of course, then again, it's also possible that he knew he was writing for a mostly theistic or God-believing audience, and so he just adapted his writing style to keep his audience. But all that aside, what I really want to focus on today is Hume's attack on the possibility of miracles. It's really one of his more famous works. David Hume was a dedicated empiricist, which means he wasn't going to believe something unless there was abundant proof. An empiricist is somebody whose epistemology, whose understanding of how we actually know things, is grounded in the evidence of our senses. Mr. Hume was so insistent on empiricism, on demanding proof for everything he was going to believe, that it actually led to some logical conundrums. And maybe I'll dedicate another show to those conundrums on another day, because I think some real problems emerged from his theories about knowledge. But for today, I just want to focus on his rather short essay that deals with miracles. And maybe, to kick the ball down the field, I'll just read you an excerpt I believe sums up his thinking about the subject. Hume writes this: "A wise man, therefore, proportions his belief to the evidence. In such conclusions as are founded on an infallible experience, he expects the event with the last degree of assurance and regards his past experience as a full proof of the future existence of that event." What he's basically describing is what you and I might call the scientific method, an approach to the world that was all the rage during the Enlightenment, when Hume was busy writing all this stuff. And of course, I happen to be a big fan of the scientific method because of all the good that came out of it. It's a reliable approach that yields meaningful discovery. I mean, if it wasn't for the scientific method, we might still be drilling holes in people's skulls to let the demons out when they had a migraine. So, there's validity to what Hume is saying. The very essence of a science experiment is to determine whether or not something is repeatable, whether or not you can make it happen again under the very same circumstances. So, if Galileo drops a ball from the Leaning Tower of Pisa and it falls to the ground, and he does that 4 million times in a row and gets the same result every single time, then on the 4 millionth and first time, it's logical to predict that the ball is going to drop to the ground in exactly the same way. Hume is telling us that he believes that's how a wise person makes all their decisions. And for the most part, obviously, I'd have to agree. It's usually a wise thing to go with the weight of the evidence. And of course, in the case that your scientific experiments do not produce 100% identical results, then you have to go with the result that happens most often. In all cases, Hume writes, we must balance the opposite experiments, where they are opposite, and deduct the smaller number from the greater in order to know the exact force of the superior evidence. Again, it's the weight of the evidence. And the irony of this passage, if I'm being perfectly honest, is that I use a similar approach when it comes to studying the Bible. I'm convinced that the Bible presents itself as a harmonized whole, in spite of the fact that the authors of the various books of the Bible lived centuries apart from each other, and they were approaching their subject from a wide variety of backgrounds and perspectives. So, when you read the Bible trying to figure out what it says about a particular subject, say, for example, what happens when somebody dies, what I need to do is read the entire book and then consider the weight of the evidence. And interestingly enough, that's really what Hume was saying about life in general. the smartest thing you can do is gather all the evidence and place your confidence in the majority evidence. So, for example, if you have one or two bits of evidence that appear to imply that the Earth is flat, but you have overwhelming evidence that it's a sphere, the wise person's going to go with the sphere, because there's probably something wrong with the understanding that comes from the minority evidence. Now, from that point, Hume moves on to the problem of eyewitness testimony. And this is really where Hume's distaste for cause and effect comes into play. He said, you cannot prove that certain events cause other events to happen. We only live under that impression, he said, because of our experience. But there's no absolute proof that cause and effect are actually real things. It's just a matter of probability. In his famous essay on miracles, this is how he puts it. It being a general maxim that no objects have any discoverable connection together, and that all the inferences which we can draw from one to the other are founded merely on our experience of their constant and regular conjunction, it is evident that we ought not to make an exception to this maxim in favor of human testimony, whose connection with any event seems in itself as little necessary as any other. What he's saying is that eyewitness testimony does not prove causality, even if 1,000 people witness the very same thing. So, for example, the Bible states that more than 500 people saw Jesus back from the dead. But from David Hume's perspective, that wouldn't prove anything. It doesn't prove that God somehow violated the laws of nature and raised a person from the dead. What you should do, he argued, is go by the weight of the evidence from your own perspective. And I understand why he thought that way. Most of us know that dead people do not generally come back to life. I mean, I've witnessed hundreds of deaths and not one single resurrection. According to Hume, that's how you need to judge the story of the Bible. If I'm confronted with one story of a resurrection, I need to go back to my own experience and say, that's not very likely. And even if the eyewitnesses were highly reliable, people we really trust, he still says you should ignore what they say and go with your own experience. But then there's this hypothetical situation he brings up that appears to contradict his stubborn insistence on his show me the proof approach. He supposes that a person from the far north travels down to the Indian subcontinent and tells an Indian prince about frozen lakes and rivers. And of course, the prince has never seen any such thing because he lives in a much warmer climate. And Hume suggests that the most rational course of action would be for that prince to deny the reality of ice and snow because he's never seen them. Here's what David Hume writes. The inhabitants of Sumatra have always seen water fluid in their own climate, and the freezing of their rivers ought to be deemed a prodigy. But they never saw water in Muscovy during the winter, and therefore they cannot reasonably be positive what would there be the consequence. A frozen river in India would seem like a miracle to people who had never witnessed it before. It would look like an event that violates the laws of nature, at least the way they understood them. And Hume argues that it isn't really a miracle. It just looks like one because the people who lived their entire lives in that warm climate just haven't done the experiments with cold temperatures. What they need to do, he says, is send a search party to Russia to add to their empirical database, and at that point, the ice will no longer seem like a miracle. So, you can probably see where this is going when it comes to the miracles of the Bible. He's going to dismiss them as highly improbable and probably not worth believing. But now I've got to take a break, and there's a very high degree of probability that I'll be right back after this.
Life can throw a lot at us. Sometimes we don't have all the answers. But that's where the Bible comes in. It's our guide to a more fulfilling life. Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we've created the Discover Bible Guides to be your guide to the Bible. They're designed to be simple, easy to use, and provide answers to many of life's toughest questions. And they're absolutely free. So jump online now, or give us a call and start your journey of discovery.
In order for us to understand why David Hume rejected the possibility of miracles, we really need to understand his definition of a miracle, which he explains like this. He writes, "A miracle is a violation of the laws of nature, And as firm and unalterable experience has established these laws, the proof against a miracle, from the very nature of the fact, is as entire and as any argument from experience that can possibly be imagined. In other words, he says, if you haven't seen it happen, then it probably isn't true. And I'll give him credit where credit is due. For a lot of life, that works. If a human being dies, you believe it because you've seen it before. But if that same human being comes back to life, then Hume might argue that it probably isn't true because, well, you've never seen that before. But let's just think about that for a minute. I'm going to borrow an example from a YouTube video I was watching the other day, so I can't claim any kind of original thinking here. But for a really long time, the scientific community denied the existence of meteorites, something that you and I take for granted. And why did they deny the existence of meteorites? Well, they had never actually seen one. And the idea that rocks can fall from the sky seemed absolutely ludicrous. Now, never mind the fact that countless people had already found them for centuries. And they said those are just lay people, they don't have scientific credibility. Never mind the fact that you can actually see meteors flash across the sky on almost any given night. And never mind the fact that people have actually found them on the ground still warm from their entry into the atmosphere. If a scientist hadn't seen it with his or her own eyes, then it couldn't possibly be true. Why? Because in their experience, rocks don't fall from the sky. In fact, back at the beginning of the 19th century, somebody was delivering a lecture on the possibility of meteorites to the French Academy of Science. And the great scientist Pierre Laplace, who did not believe in meteorites, apparently stood up in that meeting and shouted, "We've had enough of such myths." And why did he object so angrily? It's because the evidence was coming from the eyewitness testimony of mere lay people. So in other words, if it doesn't happen in a lab, then it doesn't happen at all. The hostility of the scientific community was so fierce at that time that some museums actually got rid of their meteorite collections, assuming it couldn't possibly be true. And that's the biggest problem with Hume's approach. He kind of made himself and his own experience the final arbiter of truth. Never mind the fact that 500 people saw Jesus come back from the dead. They were somehow mistaken or deluded, he said, or they were just lying in order to perpetuate their belief. And he said that because he had never seen any such thing. Now, I've got to be honest. On the one hand, I kind of admire his skepticism because I'm a bit of a skeptic myself. I want proof before I'm willing to consider what you're trying to convince me of is true. And I continue to believe that a healthy dose of skepticism serves most of us very well. I mean, we're living at a time when people are buying wild conspiracy theories because of some video they saw on the internet. And I'm a little appalled at how easy it is to convince some people of wackadoodle theories. But then again, on the other hand, am I really going to accept the idea that because I've never seen something before, it's not possible? I mean, until we delved into the world of quantum mechanics, we would have never believed it was possible for particles to exist in two locations at once because we'd never seen something like that before. So is David Hume's insistence that we instantly dismiss anything we don't understand really the best approach for life? I mean, just listen to what he says. He tells the story of a clergy member who heard about the miracle of a man with one leg who rubbed holy oil on the stump and suddenly grew a new leg. And David Hume doubted it, just like I would. Here's what he said about that clergy member's skepticism. He therefore concluded, like a just reasoner, that such an evidence carried falsehood upon the very face of it, and that a miracle supported by any human testimony was more properly a subject of derision than of argument. But you know, I think it's here that David Hume kind of gives his hand away, because the scientific method does not demand that you ridicule new ideas. And it leads me to believe that Hume really doesn't want miracles to be true. Now, whether or not that particular story of the leg was true, it doesn't really matter. The American philosopher William James suggested that you and I tend to ignore new ideas that do not click with our current worldview. Or, to use his own analogy, those new ideas don't cause an electrical connection with your brain when you try to plug them in. It's what most people would call confirmation bias. When you accept the things you want to believe and you reject everything else, and every single one of us does that. Now, of course, when it comes to miracles, that can cut two ways. I've seen secular people reject potential miracles because they don't want them to be true. But then again, I've seen well-meaning Christians look for miracles where there are none because they want it to be true. And the problem is that many of the biggest advancements in science would have never happened if we rigidly followed Hume's way of thinking. Let's go back to people like Copernicus or Galileo, people who insisted that the sun was the center of the solar system. The collective logic of the West at that time stated otherwise. It seemed obvious to most people that the Earth was the center of the system because the sun rises on the eastern side of the sky in the morning, crosses over our heads during the day, and then sets in the west at night. Every single day. By all obvious appearances, the sun appears to be orbiting the Earth. But suddenly we had some people insisting that the opposite is true. The Earth is orbiting the sun and not the other way around. Now, the common sense of the day would suggest that Copernicus was wrong because we'd been living with a different model for a really long time. And honestly, it was a useful model, the old one, because it was regular and predictable. The math actually worked, and it was useful for things like navigation. Almost all of our everyday experience appeared to contradict Copernicus, and so, from Hume's perspective, we probably should have just ignored him or made fun of him, as a lot of people did. Now, to be fair to Hume, he would argue that the Copernican model was not a violation of the laws of nature. It was just a deeper understanding of them. Miracles, however, must be rejected, he said, because they clearly violate those laws. The only way you should ever accept a miracle, he said, is if the falsification of that miracle seems even more absurd than the miracle itself. But you know, under all of that is this assumption that the Creator would be bound by the laws of the physical universe and God would never be able to suspend those laws or override them. But why would that be true? The book of Genesis makes it quite clear that God is distinct from His creation, and it talks about something theologians might call fiat creation. God created the universe by speaking it into existence. He didn't have to wrangle with pre-existent materials. He simply thought and spoke the entire universe into existence. And that's a really important concept. It's one of the things that makes the Genesis account much different than pagan mythology. You'll notice there's no origin story for God in the Bible, and His existence is not dependent on the material universe. It shows us that space and time were God's invention, and He is not bound by the laws of nature. So, why couldn't God raise somebody from the dead? Whether or not that's possible does not rely on David Hume's assumptions. I would have to argue, especially in light of Hume's analogy of the Indian prince who struggled to believe in the existence of ice, that just because you've never seen it, that doesn't mean it isn't out there somewhere. And it doesn't mean that somebody else's eyewitness report is necessarily ridiculous or false. I'll be right back after this.
Dragons, beasts, cryptic statues. Bible prophecy can be incredibly vivid and confusing. If you've ever read Daniel or Revelation and come away scratching your head, you're not alone. Our free Focus on Prophecy guides are designed to help you unlock the mysteries of the Bible and deepen your understanding of God's plan for you and our world. Study online or request them by mail and start bringing prophecy into focus today.
So now let me tell you about one of my own encounters with the seemingly miraculous so that we can just think about this a little bit more. About 2 decades ago, I was working in South Asia, and we had something like 25,000 people attending a series of lectures that I was presenting. And knowing that I was a Christian minister, hundreds of people would line up after I was finished talking, hoping I would just pray for them. And some nights I would be standing there for hours. Now, there was one evening where a mother approached me with her little boy who appeared to be, about 10 or 12. His face was tragically disfigured. One of his eyes was significantly lower than the other, and the eyeball itself was diseased and obviously non-functional. It was tragic. It was awful. So she asked that I would pray for her boy, and of course, I did it. I was happy to do that. Then the next night, the same woman approached me with another boy who also appeared to be about 10 or 12 years of age, but this boy looked perfectly healthy. And she noticed that I was kind of missing the point, and she said, "You don't recognize him, do you? You don't recognize my boy." And then she told me it was the same boy whose eye had been healed overnight. Now, personally, I've seen enough of that kind of thing over the years that I no longer doubt that it's possible. Experience has taught me that sometimes it happens. But at the same time, given the number of religious hucksters who dominate the airwaves here in America healing people for money, well, I'm also skeptical. And there are all kinds of plausible explanations for what I saw that night. Maybe she had twin boys. Maybe she brought me the healthy boy to deceive me. Or maybe I misunderstood what the translator was telling me. But then, I've got to ask myself, why in the world would that mother try to deceive me? Conversion from Hinduism to Christianity is not just frowned upon in that particular location, it was completely illegal. I could go to prison if somebody thought I had a role in somebody's choice to become a Christian believer. So what would be the point of trying to fool me with a miracle? And of course, you could probably think of reasons. I mean, maybe she was looking for fame and publicity, which might give her a ticket out of her poverty. But logic tells me she didn't have a reason to lie about this. It's not like she was motivated to affirm my Christian faith. If anything, most of the people I met didn't want to believe the claims of the Bible. So if I'm going to ask myself what's most probable after years and years of thinking about this, I lean in the direction of believing her. And yes, I might be suffering from confirmation bias, but let me tell you this. I don't suffer from confirmation bias any more than David Hume did. And just because he didn't see something, that doesn't make it untrue. I mean, just ask yourself how many generations have denied the possibility of human flight? We all know you and I are heavier than air, and prior to the Wright brothers, we had a uniform experience with gravity. Men who jumped off of high places, hit the ground, and died. Of course, Hume would tell us we're only being skeptical about flying because we had not yet expanded our understanding of the universe. But then I might be tempted to reply by saying that the only reason he did not appear to believe in a God who intervenes in the affairs of this world is because he had not yet expanded his understanding of the universe to include a supreme being. And oddly enough, a lot of highly qualified people today are starting to wonder if there didn't have to be some kind of sentient being who started this universe in motion, because the laws of physics now appear to demand such a thing. What we have in the pages of the Bible is 1,500 years of testimony from people who said they interacted with something or somebody that transcends our everyday experience. And one theme that shows up in this book over and over and over and over is the idea that we cannot fully comprehend what lies beyond our personal experience. And I'm thinking about that moment when Job finished questioning God and God took a turn questioning Job. This is found in Job chapter 38. It says, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind and said, 'Who is this who darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Now prepare yourself like a man. I will question you, and you shall answer me. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? To what were its foundations fastened? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy?'" Of course, a critic might point out it's a little convenient to suggest that we just need faith to approach an incomprehensible God. But then again, if there was an omniscient God, of course he'd be somewhat incomprehensible. And I guess what I'm driving at is this. David Hume seems to have made himself the final arbiter of truth, and that's an approach with all kinds of problems. There's a reason that epistemology continues to be studied today, because we don't really know how we know things or how we can know them for sure. And Hume's insistence that a transcendent God would have to live by the rules of the physical universe he created, well, Hume is putting God in a category that the Bible does not appropriate to him. Now, I realize I'm probably not convincing some people of anything, and given the rather lengthy effort that Hume put into his philosophy, there's no way I'll do this subject justice. But I will say this. It seems to me that Hume was inventing his own definition for what God needs to be, And when that didn't look right, he shoots down that definition. I'll be right back after this.
Here at the Voice of Prophecy, we're committed to creating top-quality programming for the whole family, like our audio adventure series, Discovery Mountain. Discovery Mountain is a Bible-based program for kids of all ages and backgrounds. Your family will enjoy the faith-building stories from this small mountain summer camp and town. With 24 seasonal episodes every year and fresh content every week, there's always a new adventure just on the horizon.
I think we're going to have to come back to David Hume some other day because he's been really influential and I've barely scratched the surface. But maybe for now, let me just say this. If there's one thing that most skeptics have in common, it's their insistence on defining what God needs to be from their perspective and then blowing that straw man apart. For example, some skeptics insist that God should never ever take a life, even though he's the author of life and presumably gets to define such rules. Or they might insist that if God is real, he's morally bound to intervene before anything bad ever happens, every single time. Even though, if he does exist, you'd think he'd be the one who gets to define what is moral and what is not. So maybe today I'll just leave you with a bit of an apparent paradox, which seems appropriate for today's show. There are two opposite ideas that are held in tension all the way through the Bible. On the one hand, we're told that we can never truly know God. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, God says in Isaiah 59, so are my ways higher than your ways and my thoughts than your thoughts. But then on the other hand, the book of Jeremiah says this, thus says the Lord, let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, let not the mighty man glory in his might, nor let the rich man glory in his riches. But let him who glories glory in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord, exercising loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. If God is real, that would mean that you and I will always struggle to explain him. Because, after all, if we fully comprehended God, that would mean we had become God. But then at the same time, he invites you to know him. And what he specifically says is that you can know his character. God doesn't have to part the Red Sea or bring back the dead to convince me. He doesn't have to suspend the laws of nature to reveal himself. And I challenge you to pick up a Bible for yourself and have a look at what it says about who he is. I'm Shawn Boonstra. This has been Authentic. Thanks for joining me.